Chapter 3. The killings of Anna Brown and Charles Whitehorn caused a sensation. A banner headline in the Pawhuska Daily Capital read, "Two separate murder cases are unearthed almost at the same time." Was it just coincidence that both victims had been wealthy Osage Indians in their 30s, or was this perhaps the work of a repeat killer? Lizzie relied on Molly to deal with the authorities. During Lizzie's lifetime, many of the Osage had been separated from their traditions. Lewis F. Burns, an Osage historian, wrote that when oil was discovered, the tribe had been, quote, set adrift in a strange world, adding that there was nothing familiar to clutch and stay afloat in the world of white man's wealth. In the old days, an Osage clan, which included a group known as the Travelers in the Midst, would take the lead whenever the tribe was undergoing sudden changes. Though Molly often felt bewildered by the upheaval around her, she took the lead for her family, a modern traveler in the midst. She spoke English and was married to a white man, and she had resisted the temptation that hurt many young members of the tribe, including Anna. To some Osage, especially elders like Lizzie, oil was a cursed blessing. Someday this oil will go, and there will be no more fat checks every few months from the Great White Father, an Osage chief said in 1928. There'll be no fine motor cars and no new clothes. Then I know my people will be happier. Molly pressed the authorities to investigate Anna's murder, but most white folks seemed to have little interest, so Molly turned to Ernest's uncle, William Hale. He was one of the most successful businessmen in the county, and he had campaigned for law and order for the protection of what he called God-fearing souls. Hale, who had an owlish face and stiff black hair and a small, alert eyes set in shaded hollows, had settled on the reservation nearly 2 decades earlier. He seemed to have come out from nowhere, a man with no known past, arriving in the territory with little more than the clothes on his back and an worn Old Testament. He began what a person who knew him well called a, quote, fight for life and fortune in a raw state of civilization. Hale found work as a cowboy on a ranch. Before trains crisscrossed the West, cowboys drove cattle from Texas to Osage territory, where the herds grazed on the lush blue stem grass, and on to Kansas for shipment to Chicago and then to other cities. These cattle drives fueled the American fascination with cowboys, but their work was hardly romantic. Hale toiled day and night for little money, and he rode through storms, hail, lightning, and sand, and survived stampedes when he had to guide them into smaller and smaller circles so they wouldn't trample him. His clothes carried the stench of sweat and manure, and his bones were frequently battered, if not broken. Eventually, he hollered and borrowed enough money to buy his own herd in the Osage Territory. He is the most energetic man I ever knew, a man who invested in his business, recalled. Even when he crossed the street, he walked as if he were going after something big. But Hale soon went bankrupt, a bit of failure, and only stoked the furnace of his ambition. After he started over in the cattle business, he often slept in a tent on the windy plains, alone in the fury. Years later, a reporter described how he paced before a fire like a leashed animal. He nervously rubbed his hands into the flames. His rather ruddy face was aglow with cold and excitement. Hale became an expert cattleman, and his profits rose. He bought more and more territory from the Osage and neighboring settlers until he owned some 45,000 acres of the finest grazing lands in the country, as well as a small fortune. Then he went into work on himself. He replaced his ragged trousers and cowboy hat with a suit, a bow tie, and a felt hat. His eyes looked through distinguished round-rimmed glasses. He married a schoolteacher and had a daughter who adored him. He recited poetry. Pawnee Bill, a legendary Wild West showman and a one-time partner of Buffalo Bill, described Hale as a high-class gentleman. He was named a reserve deputy sheriff of Fairfax. The position enabled him to carry a badge and lead a posse, and he sometimes kept one pistol in his side pocket and another strapped to his hip. They represented, he'd like to say, his authority as an officer of the law. As Hale's wealth and power grew, politicians courted his support, knowing that he could that they couldn't win without his blessing. He outworked and outwitted his rivals, made plenty of enemies who wanted him dead. Some did hate him, a friend admitted. Still, Molly Burkhart, with many others, considered him Osage County's greatest benefactor. He had aided the Osage before they were flush with oil money, donating to charities and schools and a hospital. He even assumed the label of preacher, signing his letters Reverend W.K. Hale. A local doctor said, "I couldn't begin to remember how many sick people have received medical attention at his expense, nor how many hungry mouths have tasted of his bounty." Later, Hale would write a letter to an assistant chief of the tribe saying, "I never had been a better friend in my life than the Osages. I will always be the Osages' true friend." In this last will and testament, in this last remnant of the American frontier, Hale was revered as the king of the Osage Hills. Hale frequently came by Molly's house to pick up Ernest, not long after Anna's burial. He showed him up to pay his respects to Molly and her mother. He vowed to get justice for Anna. He had always expressed affection for Anna. "We were mighty good friends," he said, and he served as a pallbearer at her funeral. Molly remembered seeing Hale huddled with Ernest during one visit, apparently talking about hunting down whoever had murdered her sister. A short time later, Molly went to testify at a hearing in Fairfax. The U.S. Department of the Interior Office of Indian Affairs, which oversaw government relations with tribe, was later renamed the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had a field agent assigned to two of the Osage territory who knew Molly. He said that she was willing to do everything she can in order to bring the guilty parties into justice. The authorities had provided a translator for Molly, but she waved him off and spoke in succinct English the way the nuns had taught her as a child. So let's pause and look on page 25 and look at the two pictures of William Hale. Page 26. Molly described for the jurors the final time that Anna visited her house. She said that her sister had left around sundown. In a later proceeding, a government official asked her, "How did she go?" "She goes in a car." "Who was with her?" "Brian Burkhart." "Did you notice which direction they went?" "Towards Fairfax." "Was anyone else in the car with Brian and Anna?" "No, just Brian and Anna." "Did you see her any more after that?" Molly stayed composed. "No." "You saw her body after it was found?" "Yes." "How long was it after this time you saw her leave your mother's place with Brian Burkhart?" "You saw her body?" "About 5 or 6 days ago." Where did you see the body?" "At the pasture, just right there." While Molly seemed eager to answer every question to make sure that nothing was missed, the justice of the peace and the jurors asked her barely anything. Perhaps they discounted her because of their prejudice, because she was an Osage and a woman. The panel spent more time questioning Brian Burkhart. Many locals had begun to whisper about him. After all, he was the last person with Anna before she went missing. Brian lacked the good looks of his brother Ernest, Molly's husband, and there was something cold about his appearance. He had uncomfortably steady eyes. Hale had once caught him stealing his cattle, and to teach his nephew a lesson, he filed charges against him. The county prosecutor asked Brian about that day, if he had given Anna a ride to her house. "When you brought her back, where did you go?" "Come to town." "When was this?" About 5 or 4:30. "You haven't seen her since then?" "No, sir." At one point, the county prosecutor paused and asked, "Positive?" "Yes, sir." A later hearing, Ernest was also questioned. A law enforcement officer pressed him about his brother. "You understand he's the last person to see this woman, Anna Brown?" "I understand," Ernest replied, adding that Brian told him he left her at the house. That was his story. "Do you believe him?" "Yes, sir." Brian was jailed by the authorities after the first hearing. To Molly's distress, they even had Ernest, too. in case he was covering for his younger brother, but both men were soon turned loose. There was no evidence trying Brian to the crime other than the fact that he had been with Anna before she disappeared. When Ernest was asked if he had any information as to how Anna met her death, he said no, adding, I don't know of enemies she had or anyone that disliked her. The main theory was that her killer was someone from outside the reservation. Once, the tribe's enemies had battled them on the plains. Now they came in the form of train robbers and stick-up men and other desperados. The passages of prohibition outlawing alcohol had only added to the territory's feeling of lawlessness by creating, in the works of one historian, the greatest criminal bonanza in American history. Few places in the country were as chaotic as Osage County, where there was an amount of oil money by one account more than the value of the Old West gold rushes combined, had drawn every kind of villain from across the country. An official with the U.S. Department of Justice warned that there were more fugitives hiding out in the Osage Hills than perhaps any other county in the state or any state in the Union. Among them was the hard-boiled stick-up man Irvin Thompson, who was known as Blackie. A lawman described him as the meanest man I ever handled. Even more notorious was Al Spencer, the so-called Phantom Terror, who had made the transition of galloping horses to speeding getaway cars and had inherited from Jesse James the title of the region's most infamous outlaw. Members of Spencer's gang, including Dick Gregg and Frank Jelly Nash, were themselves ranked among the most dreaded outlaws of the day. A more unnerving theory was that Anna's death was that her killer was living among them, hiding in sheep's clothing. Molly and others began to suspect Anna's ex-husband, Oda Brown, who called himself a businessman but spent most of the time partying. In retrospect, his grief had seemed almost too intense. After Anna divorced him, she had denied him any inheritance, leaving virtually all her fortune to her mother. Since the burial, Brown had hired a lawyer and tried unsuccessfully to fight the will. The investigator concluded that Brown was absolutely no good and capable of doing almost anything for money. Several weeks after the funeral, a man had been arrested in Kansas for check forgery and sent a letter to the sheriff, Fries, claiming that he had information about Anna's murder. Upon receiving the message, the sheriff sent out for Kansas jail in what the press described as a fast automobile. Hale, who had been tipped off about the potential breakthrough, rushed to the jail as well. Under interrogation, the forger, a fidgety 28-year-old man, claimed that Brown had paid him $8,000 to murder Anna. The forger also described how he killed her. Soon after his confession, a posse of lawmen swept in and seized Brown when he was in Pawhuska on business. The Pawhuska Daily Capital heralded the news. Anna Brown's slayer confessed crime. It added, Oda Brown, husband of woman, also arrested. Molly and her family were devastated by the report of Anna's ex-husband was responsible for her murder, but they took comfort in the thought of his facing justice. Within days, however, authorities said that there was no evidence to support the forger's claims, no evidence that he had been in Osage County at the time of the murder or that Brown had ever contacted him. The authorities had no choice but to release Brown. There's lots of talk, the sheriff was quoted saying, but you have to have proof, not talk. Page 31. Like many officials, the county prosecutor owed his election, at least in part, to William Hale, who had helped turn out the vote for him. Hale met with him about Anna's murder. Eventually, the county prosecutor decided to look again for the bullet the investigators missed during Anna's autopsy. He even got a court order to unbury Anna. But once again, the Schoen brothers found nothing. The bullet appeared to have vanished. By July 1921, the Justice of the Peace had completed his investigation, stating that Anna Brown's death had come at the hands of parties unknown. The same finding as delivered in the Whitehorn inquest. The justice locked away in his office the little evidence that he had gathered in case more information came to light. Meanwhile, Lizzie, who had once had the same energy and determination as Molly, had grown sicker. Each day she seemed to drift farther away. It was as if she had the same peculiar wasting illness that consumed her daughter Minnie. Desperate for help, Molly turned to the Osage medicine men who chanted when the eastern sky was red like blood. She also looked to the new breed of medicine men, the Schoen brothers, who carried their portions in black bags. Nothing seemed to work. Molly kept vigil over her mother, over the last tethers to the tribe's ancient way of life. Molly could not cure her, but she could feed her, and she could brush her long, beautiful silvery hair from her face, a face that was lined and expressive and that maintained its aura. One day that July, less than 2 months after Anna's murder, Lizzie stopped breathing. Molly couldn't revive her. Lily's spirit had been claimed by Jesus Christ, the Lord and Savior, and by Wakanta, the great mystery. Molly was overwhelmed with grief. As an Osage morning prayer went, "Have pity on me, O great Spirit. You see, I cry forever. Dry my eyes and give me comfort." At this point, here is a recording of that in Osage. Bill Smith, the husband of Molly's sister Rita, was one of the first to wonder if there was something curious about Lizzie's death, coming so soon after the murders of Anna and Whitehorn. Bill had also expressed deep frustration over the authorities' investigation, and he began looking into the matter himself. Like Molly, he was struck by a particular vagueness of Lily's sickness. No doctor had ever pinpointed what was causing it. Indeed, no one had uncovered any natural cause of her death. The more Bill searched, the more he was certain that Lizzie had died of something dreadfully unnatural, poison. And Bill was sure that all three deaths were connected, somehow, to the Osage's underground reservoir of black gold.